All right. I kind of wait for my cue is when the participant list, the acceleration on the number slows down. So we will go ahead and get started. So I just want to say a big thank you and greetings to everyone and welcome to this session of the Generative AI Teaching Conversation webinar series. My name is Sean Leahy. I'm the Director of Creative and Emerging Technologies for Enterprise Technology here at ASU, and I'll be your host today. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Provost Office for hosting this 30-minute engaging conversation with our expert panelists here from ASU to provide an opportunity for faculty, staff, and students to engage in contemporary and emerging discussions around the use of generative AI in higher education. And for today's topic, we'll be exploring ways that generative AI can impact academic integrity, among other things. And to do that, you can clearly see we've assembled a wonderful panel of experts today. So let me go ahead and introduce each of our panelists to say hello. First up, we have Kyle Jensen. Kyle is the Director of Writing Programs and Professor in the Department of English's Writing, Rhetoric, and Literacies program here at ASU. His research explores modern rhetorical theory and rhetorical education. Kyle has authored Reimagining Process, Online Writing Archives, and the Future of Writing Studies, and co-edited Abducting Writing Studies and the War of Words. Welcome, Kyle. Next up, we have Scotty Craig. Scotty is an associate professor of human systems engineering within the Polytechnic School of the Ira A. Fulton Schools of Engineering at ASU. Dr. Craig is a learning engineer and has investigated research areas of emotion learning, multimedia learning, and intelligent tutoring systems in both laboratory and applied classroom settings. Dr. Craig is currently the graduate chair of the Human Systems Engineering program and the president for the University Senate of the Polytechnic campus. Welcome, Scotty. And then also joining us today is Pavan Taraga. Pavan is director and professor in the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering and the School of Electrical, Computer, and Energy Engineering at ASU. Pavan's research spans representational foundations for structured and unstructured data, including time series, image, video, 3D point clouds, and more, and their applications in areas such as interactive systems, machine learning, computer vision, and mobile health. Glad to have you with us, Pavan.
Thank you, Sean. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So for today's topic, again, we're sort of picking up where we left off last week a little bit, and just kind of back up for our audience here too. You know, the discussion of generative AI in higher education has been a highly active space of conversation, especially going back to the last fall with the release of things like OpenAI's ChatGPT, among other things, Microsoft's Bing, more recently, Google Bard. And when we kind of look at all these conversations, we've been looking at all aspects of this newly accessible technology. Last week's webinar, we started off by taking a closer look at some of the basic understanding, at least from an operational level, of what are generative AI tools and what kinds of tools are out there and how they might be used. But in the past 6 or 7 months or so, we've seen a multitude of stories in popular press and news outlets that sort of run the full gamut or the full spectrum of responses to these new tools. We've seen institutions and organizations embracing the potential to create new, authentic, deeper learning experiences by leveraging generative AI tools in their educational systems. And we've also seen groups take the opposite stance, and individuals and groups banning tools, calling for halts in development. And of course, anytime we're talking about AI, there always seems to be some level of an existential conversation around those when we talk about AI and human experiences. But I think one thing that we touched on before also that I think is relevant to our conversation today is that an element that's often present in our discussions that's not unique to AI, but more broadly to all technological innovations, is the fact that often these new innovations and disruptions outpace regulatory, legal, and policy frameworks. So given that as a sort of collective global society, we're in this new era of having these new tools at our fingertips, so to speak, and figuring out what we can make of it all. And I would be really curious to dig into some of these issues with this wonderful panel here and how we move forward with these new tools in our setting in higher education, and specifically, what are the academic considerations we make for those? So to get us started, Scotty, I'd like to kind of look to your direction to kind of answer this first question for the panel to get us the conversation moving is, you know, how do we think about cultivating a positive outlook on the potential learning advancements that generative AI presents? And, you know, we could talk about how we might explore those potentials and how we might look at those things to assist these particular areas, and also how do we ensure that we don't undermine academic integrity by leveraging some of those tools?
Okay. Thank you, Sean. And hopefully my colleagues will also can feel free to chime in as I'm talking. Um, but yeah, as far as I think it is important for us to kind of take a more positive outlook. I mean, it's very easy to kind of get a kind of doom and gloom outlook that there's this new thing, it's generative AI is going to come in and it's going to kind of take over. It's going to allow students to basically very easily cheat, and we're not going to be able to detect it. It's very easy for us to fall into that mindset. But I think that the problem with that is, I'm not saying that it's not a valid concern. It is. But I think it's better to look at it from a learning perspective than an assessment perspective. And then if you look at it from the point of view of assessments, assessments are there to gauge students' knowledge. The thing with assessments, though, is that students, will they cheat with generative AI? Yes. Have they been cheating since we started using these forms of assessments? Yes, they have. Cheating has always been with us. It's always been a game of, can we catch them or not? But one thing I think if we think about it more as a, positive aspects of it, and that there's actually some research out there looking at cheating, and cheating is actually not always bad for learning, which is kind of counterintuitive. But if the cheating process in and of itself can reinforce the learning content, the cheating process then becomes a learning experience for the students. And I think that's kind of how we're going to have to start thinking about the implementation of generative AI, is that it is an opportunity to learn. And how do we get students to actually learn through that application? And there are models out there. So, for example, I really like Chris Wicken's model that looks at human interaction or human automation interaction. And he actually has an entire very elaborate model, which I won't go into all of it, but basically shows that when you have humans and technology such as generative AI interacting, sometimes people will fail, sometimes they won't. And one of the big things that kind of informs the success of that is if the user, the human, actually understands the limitations of the technology. And I think that's what's going to be really important going forward, is that we're going to have to start making sure that students understand that generative AI can be useful in some situations, but it's not perfect. And they have to see that transparency and the fixing and recovering from when it's going to fail. That's going to be learning experiences for students.
Yeah, that's powerful. Kyle or Pavan, any kind of thoughts on that same question?
Well, I may be a broken record. I'm not sure how many of the audience members have heard me talk about
We'll
generative
pretend
AI.
we'll pretend nobody.
Okay, let's
This is a
pretend
safe
nobody
space
and
to
that
be.
I'm not simply repeating myself.
That's right.
It's always good to reinforce.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean,
Reinforcement.
look, I'm a rhetorician, and the first move of all, rhetorical negotiations is to define our terms. And so my concern when we talk about generative AI, um, in really broad strokes, especially as it relates to academic integrity violations, is that it presupposes that all generative AI tools are made equally. It's a little bit like saying, I eat Italian food. Like, you could go and have a pre-made, frozen dinner that you buy from the grocery store and call that Italian, or you could go all the way up to, the highest quality Italian restaurant that you can imagine. And if we lump all of those things together, there's some nuance that gets missed in between. And so, when I talk about generative AI, one of the things that I think is particularly helpful as a framework, especially with regard to teaching, is what is the form of the AI? And that's a technical term in my field the person that I write about most regularly, Kenneth Burke, characterizes form as the creation and fulfillment of expectations. So if you use that as a basic framework for evaluating a generative AI tool, like let's say ChatGPT, how does its interface, how does the way that it functions create expectations about what the work of writing looks like, and how does it fulfill it? I think the biggest concern about ChatGPT, at least for me as a writing professor and as director of the writing programs, is that it communicates to students that a tool can circumvent the writing process. So all you need to do is put in a little bit of input, and then the output becomes a fully formed text unto itself that can pass as knowledge. Now, the people that I've talked to who use ChatGPT thoughtfully say that can be a step in the process. You can say, I need to learn a little bit about a topic that I don't know that much about. I can ask the generative AI tool, I can ask ChatGPT to help me think practically about how to form an argument in relationship to that, and then use that as a starting point for then evolving your own perspective or learning more about how arguments get formed, because after all, these large language models are built on 170 some billion text. It knows something about how arguments are formed. You compare that to another kind of technology, another generative AI technology like WordTune, for example, where instead of saying, what's the expectation, you type in a word, a sentence, or even a full paragraph, you hit enter, and then it generates 10 to 15 different options. The expectation in that situation is not, I now have something that is fully formed and I can submit it as my own. It's the expectation is you now have to make a decision based on all of the available options, and you need to invent criteria that is most useful for making that decision relative to the task at hand. In our program, we talk about the importance of audience, purpose, and situation. So what sentence, what tone, what length, whatever is the best suited for the audience, given the purpose, given the situation that you're entering into. And so I think that for a lot of folks, because ChatGPT has been so popular and has been covered so widely, there's a tendency to assume that if that's how that works, then all generative AI works that way. And I think if you look at some of the other applications, even if you look at the generative AI in like Google Docs, it has a different kind of predictive model that produces different kind of results that we can then, as Scotty was just saying, think more critically about in terms of what are its possibilities and what are its limits.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Pavan, what are your thoughts about that sort of general question about these sort of generative AI tools and integrity and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to fall back on my personal experiences in navigating life as a student and the way tech has evolved in my own career. So it's a bit personal. It's less intellectual, as my panelists have presented. Also I get to geek out a little bit in this response because, I come from engineering, and in engineering, there's always been assistive tools of different types for simplifying computation, for simplifying algorithm development, for code assistance. There is this culture that's built in debugging tools. So all these assistive tools have always been blended into curriculum. We are expected to learn them, frankly, to be competitive in a job market. So at some point, we backtrack always from where are the jobs and what do they want. It would be very quaint to say, well, you have to learn how to solve a quadratic equation on pen and paper, otherwise you haven't learned it. I mean, it might be true you haven't learned it, but there is no job that says you got to solve quadratic equations by hand. So what are you preparing them for is where I start with. So from that perspective, I think it's a great opportunity because I like to look at the full spectrum, like what's the output of a college degree? What's the output of whatever, a graduate degree or a PhD degree? Where are you going into it? And how is that job changing because of these tools? And are you prepared to use these tools to do that job more effectively? So I see a great opportunity to revise curricular expectations and presentation formats and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating too, because I think, Pavan, I think you hit an interesting point that, and I think everybody has kind of touched on that as well, right? That there has always been, as we have progressed with new technologies, new ways of doing things, there have always been closely following, right, ways to assist you in getting to those endpoints, but then thinking about how we use them. And so, Kyle, I kind of want to come back to one of the things that you had mentioned too, because I think it also getting your perspective of someone who deals with language and writing and rhetoric. And and because you kind of hit on one of the pieces too, right? This idea of like, what are those limitations and challenges on the tools that we're using? And thinking about this, like trying to reframe the conversation from one that maybe starts at like a deficit, right? This idea of cheating. Scotty, you had mentioned, right? Like, yeah, people use any shortcut at many times. That's kind of the way we are. I mean, I think, wasn't it, we were in a conversation not that long ago with Ryan Baker, who has a rich resource of longitudinal studies of tracking people in like massive online courses who have been cheating and then watching their academic performance over time. And, the spoiler was that they didn't do very well. But as we kind of, we have this new tool, and I think one of the things that was sort of alarming for a lot of people, a lot of institutions, especially when you think of those who the initial reaction was to withdraw or to shut down a technology like ChatGPT, was on the fear of cheating, right? That was undermining potentially even old or outdated or antiquated ways of assessing knowledge, but still it was there. And so, Cal, I would be curious from your perspective, because you had mentioned like the different tools, and like WordTune would give you those different options. But as we think about those different kinds of opportunities and limitations of tools, how do we start to how do we start to operationalize that when we think about the way we might start to think about how we now teach and engage in our own classrooms, in our own context with our students? What are some of the things that you and perhaps some of your colleagues are thinking about around exactly that? How are you planning to, or how are you or planning to use tools like WordTune and things like that to really enhance the student experience, rather than trying to hold it out of their grasp in to not cheat or something like that?
Yeah, we just prevent all of our students here in the English department from using those kinds of tools, and we fail them if they. I'm just kidding.
You
Look,
heard it here, folks. Don't be careful.
This is being recorded, right? Yeah, I'm gonna get a call from the president on this. Look, I have a pretty simple rule when it comes to my students, at least, and I'm meeting with my students later today, and we've done a class about methods, how to use different kinds of research methods in order to form arguments more effectively, and have used artificial intelligence as the occasion to think through how do we participate in contemporary debates in thoughtful ways. And the first rule that we have is, number one, we always, if we're going to understand and participate in a debate in the present, we need to know something about where the debate has been prior to that particular moment. Too often we act as if technologies emerge out of nothing and they don't have lineages. And one of the things that as a class we've learned quite a lot about, and this is not breaking any new territory saying that we need to learn about the history of technologies we use, but sometimes it can be a really nice counterbalance for like deficit attitudes. We say basically like when we exhibit fears or anxieties about, let's say, ChatGPT or generative AI, is that something that is peculiar to now, or is this something that has a long history that preceded long before digital computing even became a matter of public attention? And what you learn when you start to do the history, going all the way back, is that automatic writers, like these automatons that would, these engineers and would create these tools that could, and like all of a sudden, because these little robot things could write a basic sentence, somehow we are less human as a result. One of the things that I frequently talk about with the engineers who are developing these generative AI models is they say, we understand that it's now reached a level of public attention, but these generative AI models have been around for a while. And so when you start to look at that history and we start to ask, well, how has the public been interfacing with these technologies over time? Suddenly the steam comes out of the urgency to address it now. And we start to say, okay, well, why is it that we have this habituated tendency to express, this kind of apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen unless we address these technologies and, circumvent their trajectory? That's not to say that the technologies don't evolve, but it is helpful to know how human beings have historically reacted to them and what the technological precursors are that get us to this point. The other thing that I think is helpful, and again, Scotty, I'm just going to reference you here, understanding how the technology works. So, one of the things that I've been pretty proactive about is actually talking to developers of these technologies and saying, can you explain to me, because I'm an English professor, I'm having to address these issues. Tell me how it works, and what are the limits and what are the possibilities. And the engineers that I've talked to have been really generous about it. And they said, one of the really helpful things that we wish people knew more about is the fact that all of these generative models have to have refusal rules. And what they mean by that is it has to be able to say no about certain topics, and those have to be encoded into the model itself. And so if you step back and you start to say, okay, well, if you use that heuristic as a framework for understanding how the model currently works or how you would like it to work, you can ask students start to imagine, what are the refusals? Like, what are the things that this model shouldn't be able to do? And get at those underlying assumptions and getting at those underlying emotions that get attached to these technologies, prize them apart, think about them as an object of scrutiny so that we're not conflating problems. It's one thing to say we need to understand how the technology works, and it's another thing to say we need to understand how we feel about how this technology works. And sometimes those two things get so tightly wound together that we basically engage in this kind of like impressionistic argumentation where we're just saying, well, I heard this happen, and then it kind of goes sideways from there. So I think the best antidote to any kind of deficit approach is to be really particular about the problem that you're trying to solve, to understand something about the history of where the technologies have been, and then to build a robust vocabulary for naming and working through whatever negative emotions you might attach to that particular technology.
Yeah, that's really, and Kyle, it's interesting when you were talking about, looking to the past to understand like how that's one of the things that brought up top of mind. I think it was back in December, I think, when there was, sudden rush, that the first thing that popped into my head was this great presentation by Neil Postman back in 1998, talking about the 5 things to know about technological change. And and I think they're all still completely relevant today. And including one of the top ones was the challenges that are presented today are no more significant, perhaps, than what has happened in centuries before. That these do play out over time, that this is, while it is new and it feels, we get caught up in the hype cycles and all that kind of stuff, right? There is a longitudinal human history of how we adapt to these changes, right? Think about the printing press. Every major shift in these technologies has been met with, it's both the most amazing advancement in technology, and it will destroy everything as we know it. So that part isn't new, right? But building on that, talking about new, Pavan, I would be curious to get your take on, again, this idea of, moving away of that deficit and thinking about positive and productive dialogue around these types of technologies and tools. And how do you think, what are your thoughts about how we might explore the future prospects of using generative AI tools in higher education, or just even broadly for that? And, what are some things that you might see or are seeing about ways that these new tools might represent a way of revolutionizing parts of yours or people's individual contexts or fields? And yeah, what kind of things are you looking for that we might be able to explore here as future possibilities with these tools?
Sure. So to respond to that, I'll make a reference to a class that I teach, and I've developed it over the past 3 years, which is so interesting. I was anticipating, like, kind of saying, I was tracking the generative AI conversation for nearly a decade. And I mean, the first real generative model came out in 2017, I would say, the current version of things like the generative models. But I knew things are heading towards better and better. Once you have a model in the field, it just gets better over time. I could see that happen. So I floated this class called Machine Learning for Media Arts because I suspected that the arts would get very badly impacted. And without warning, some things are going to happen. I couldn't tell when, how, what form, but it was just a gut feeling. And we started in 2020. Spring 2020 was the first time it happened. The class covered generative models of that time, which were generative adversarial networks of very basic types where you could just synthesize small 64 by 64 pixel pictures, very bad quality. And it was a way for me, it was never serious art that you could produce from it, but it was a way for me to explain how machine learning works to an audience that was not familiar with machine learning. But then a year out, oh my God, things started shifting. 2021, things were a little bit better. We had other types of GANs which had come out, which were called VQ GANs and big GANs and style GANs. And suddenly you could start synthesizing higher resolution pictures within a year. I was like, oh my God, this is changing fast for me. And then we integrated that. 2022, even better. And DALI came out. By the end, I finished teaching the class. DALI was out. That was like the last week of my classes. And I was like, oh my God, the class just got over with the new tool. And spring 2023, I just finished it by spring break. And yeah, it was all about using ChatGPT to create content. The way I've seen students engage, so these are students from, it's an elective for most students. It's not a required class, but it's quite obviously titled Machine Learning for Media Arts. There is no escaping the topic. It's not about, oh, I'm going to integrate a tool into one of my usual classes. That's not the way it is. And the charge was, for the first few classes, we would talk about, the history of AI, how we landed up here, a few tools, and then people are encouraged to use any tool that they can find that advances a part of a workflow for them. What I found is interesting. So I was fortunate to have students from music, art, design, mathematics, my school, arts, media, engineering. I found that there are certain workflows in media that are more amenable to integration with machine learning. And at this point of time, even with the hype around ChatGPT, even with the hype around, oh my God, content creation is now all going to be AI, even with all that, the only one area where I felt that I could confidently say that things are going to get super fast is game design, plain and simple. Because game design tolerates a lot of imperfections in visual quality, in interaction, latency. I mean, we are very tolerant of poor quality in games. We are not so tolerant in music. We are not so tolerant in visual arts or web design and things like that. So even with all the tools that we could have access to, students all converge to this notion that, yeah, it's interesting, we can integrate parts of things into classical pipelines, but we don't see it happening. We don't see things going away, except perhaps in game design, things will get faster and faster and faster. The dev cycles are going to get faster. So I felt like that was very productive. So if I would encourage faculty to float this type of class in their fields, machine learning for rhetoric, have them use any and whatever machine learning tool and see what it does to their output. And you might be surprised that maybe the actual impactful use cases are really tiny. That's the way I would encourage people to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on something you just said, Pavan, because that was a really, I think, a really great comment about, kind of game design getting faster, because that does have a potential implication for learning. Because right now there's a huge literature and focus on serious games, and actually using serious games, immersive virtual reality for learning environments. The biggest thing that hinders it right now is generation. It takes a lot of money, resources, as far as money and time, to build these. And I think that, we may see that, I agree with you that, I think that games and game design is a very potential thing. And I think it could have a potentially interesting impact going forward with the application of games for learning and interactive and immersive virtual reality games.
I agree. I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So just looking at the time, I cannot believe the 30 minutes has kind of come and gone already. Selfishly, I think I could hold the three of you here for another hour or so and just, make a cup of coffee. We just keep on talking. So we'll definitely have to have you back. But one sort of quick question I'll just kind of pose to everybody, and let's go for a quick soundbite answer, just a couple of words. I would just be curious, what are you hopeful for in the development of this space? Let's put some time on, let's say by the time fall semester rolls around, what are you hoping to see between now and then in this big space of generative AI? Let's see who talk. Kyle, I think it's been the longest since you've had a chance to speak. So I'll start with you.
I appreciate that. I think probably Pavan and Scotty are better at giving the last word in any case. So we'll trust them to wrap this up well. I think the thing I'm most excited about in the direction of this is greater partnerships between generative AI companies and educational institutions, specifically as it relates to the development of insights platforms. So I think part of the great concern, at least that I experience as a director of a writing program, is we have students who are using these tools, but we don't really know how they're using them, and it's really difficult to measure the impact that those tools have on their literate development. So I would love to see by the fall greater levels of partnerships between these software developers and academic institutions, so there's greater levels of reciprocity so that we can actually use them to improve our teaching.
Great. I'll go in the order of introduction. So Scotty, you're next.
Okay, so very quickly on that. So where am I excited about it going? It does come down to the area of instructional technologies. And I think that the generative AIs will be able to actually start helping us build these technologies faster. They'll make it more personalized and easier to incorporate into, especially like online learning and by better engagement within online learning. So I think that's where I see it coming. Another thing, though, very quickly, and this also goes to kind of a question that was asked in the Q&A, what I'm hoping to see by next fall. There has been a big panel going on and discussions going on this entire semester about how ASU will use ChatGPT, generative AI tools. What is cheating? What are these policies around it? Policy always lags the technology, but those talks have been coming. So I'm hoping that by fall, we will actually get a lot of that language. And it will be there to actually help support us as instructors, as teachers, and clarify things for students.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Scotty. All right, Pavan, you've got the last word.
Yes, I mean, I've been hoping that, the success of AI is in some very direct ways a success for computing, mathematics, data sciences, and also now with it spilling over into art and humanities, it's potentially a success for folks who think about the impact of art on human happiness or the impact of language and rhetoric in communication. If it can be blended in that way, that now you have the tools that people who would otherwise not have the tools and the expertise to make art, to make clear, philosophically grounded arguments, are now able to do so. If it can be framed in that way, I think it would be a great success story for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Pavan, Scotty, Kyle, thank you so much for joining me today and spending this very fast 30 minutes with me and being able to have the discussion for our ASU community. And to all of our viewers who have come with us today, just on behalf of myself and the entire panel here, thank you for joining our generative AI teaching conversation. Special thank you to Sarah Elliott and Allison Hall, who have been working in the background, pushing all the buttons and making sure that this goes off without a hitch. Thank you very much for your support there. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us today. And if you're interested in learning more, please check the events calendar for future webinars, or you can see previous webinars that have been recorded. You can watch the recorded video there to catch up. But also, again, just from myself and the panelists, thank you very much. We hope you have a wonderful time, and we hope to see you again sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.